Winnipeg's training camp is officially over, and while I personally did not get to attend, we saw plenty of highlights and some interesting coverage. Find out which players might be on your must-watch list on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I mentioned, I just thought I'd open with some quick thoughts on a couple of players who, based on some accounts and some footage that's out there from Dev Camp, I thought would be worth spotlighting. Also, in general, just prospects that I think are really worth keeping an eye on going forward. Obviously, Dev Camp's not necessarily the most serious, rigorous evaluation, and we're not going to treat this like something that's anywhere close to like a real serious, preseason or competitive lineup, right? This is just a nice opportunity for some of the young kids to start working on some reps with, some of their colleagues and some of the coaching staff and get familiar with some early scrimmages. But all the same, there are some players who were still very impressive. We'll talk about who those guys are in just a quick moment. Before we dive in, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more because as playoffs wind down, obviously, sports may be over, but this summer, FanDuel still wants all customers to get hooked up with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, of course, like I was discussing earlier, obviously, we have gone through quite a bit in terms of prospect camps and stuff over the past couple of days. We've had some good scrimmages, had some nice little highlights, and by and large, I think a lot of what happened during training camp probably wasn't that, I would say, surprising. Although I will say there were some interesting little takeaways from some folks who were there and who were able to get observations. And one name that I continue to circle back to that I think for me has been honestly one of Winnipeg's most underrated prospects and somebody that I think is perhaps challenging for a spot out of preseason this upcoming year. It's Elias Salamonson. Now, Salamonson has been generally well regarded within Winnipeg's organization, but I think a lot of it has been pretty under the radar. Like in terms of fan recognition, you don't see a lot of buzz for him, which is interesting because when it comes to Winnipeg's blue line prospects, I actually think he's among our best, if not the best. Now, Alphonse Frey, who's I'm going to talk about in a little bit, might be challenging for that title eventually. But, in terms of guys who are pro-ready, who are likely to step into North America and immediately do well, and who just play a mature, composed, really well-rounded game, Salamonson is like leagues ahead of players his age. He's super smart. He's very patient. And when you see the way that he moves the puck and how he's very confident, very assertive, makes clean passes, makes clean transitions, all of that stuff is a very composed game that you would expect for a player who's about 5 to 10 years older. He's very young. He's very assertive, very confident. And I really feel that when you're talking about a player like this, he might be further along and more pro-ready in terms of North America pro hockey than we expected, right? Obviously, he's been playing overseas for a while, and he's been doing pretty well. But I think now he's ready to really make the transition over. I think it's time for him to get into at least the Manitoba Moose lineup. I think he might be good enough to actually make the NHL. A lot of it's going to depend on what Winnipeg does with their deep pairings this offseason. Obviously, Schmidt got bought out. Miller got re-signed. But if you ask me, I do kind of feel like it might be time to see if somebody would be willing to take on Neil Pionk's contract. I know that they really like Pionk, and for a lot of reasons, he's well regarded in the locker room. But in terms of his actual on-ice performance, let's be real, it's definitely taken a bit of a nosedive over the past year or so. And as much as I do enjoy him, I think it's time for that separation. I think it's time for the team to take a step back and reevaluate how that blue line is composed. And if Salamanson really does have an impressive preseason, you really do start to think about him maybe moving into the third pairing and maybe moving Miller up. Or if Salamanson really is that good, maybe he actually somehow gets a spot next to Sandberg. This is really ambitious, and obviously it's way beyond what I think is most likely to happen. But if that's his best case scenario this offseason, could be very interesting, right? I think we're going to see some very interesting battles with some of the youth in ways that I don't think people were necessarily expecting, especially with the fact that we're always said to have very weak defensive talent when it comes to our prospect pool. Like I said, I'm not expecting Salamanson to actually be fighting for a roster spot this year, but there's a part of me that wonders if he somehow ends up doing enough to maybe turn some heads. I wouldn't put it past him. He, from the day that he was drafted, I always felt that he was a much more mature prospect, right? He played a game that I felt was beyond his years. For a teenager at the time, he just seemed like he had a much more composed, more controlled, and more mature approach to the game. And maybe that's really going to bear itself out here in a couple of months. But other than that, I think one of the other guys who caught a lot of attention, aside from some of our forwards, was Alphonse Frey. And I mentioned him earlier, but Frey is very interesting in that he's very explosive. Obviously, he's still raw. There's a lot to his game that I think is going to take some time to really develop and hone into something that's NHL ready. But man, when you're talking about a need for skill and mobility, I think the Jets really understood the assignment. He was all over in the footage that I was able to catch from practice. His lateral skating and transition ability are phenomenal. His pivoting to face opposing skaters is excellent. And when it comes to skaters that are on our blue line, I think he might genuinely have one of the best releases that I've seen, right? It's a natural release that's got a great release point. He's got a lot of force on it, and it's very accurate. He was picking some corners throughout, the scrimmages in camp, and obviously, like, the goaltending and the defending are not going to be top notch when you're just doing some scrimmages. But look, by the same token, he's doing this overseas already, so it's not like it's a stretch to imagine him really turning into something very fun. He says his game is modeled off of players like Hedman and Carlson, which sounds about right. And, given his first early skates for the Jets, I am very excited for him. I think he could be a really cool prospect for the Jets. In terms of kids who really stood out, I think he'll probably have been one of the bigger names on a lot of folks' radar. And, I'm just excited to see what he can do. Obviously, you had all of the other returning cast members. I think Lambert in particular got some spotlight, partly to maybe do a little bit of spiting towards, Rutger McGroarty. Lambert was talked about as being an on-ice leader and somebody who didn't have to come to camp, but still did and wanted to work hard and make a name for himself because he wanted to play here, which sounds like a pretty clear point directed towards McGroarty's camp. So Lambert, I think, if there's one player among the forward ranks that I'm really rooting for to become like Winnipeg's star boy at forward, I think it's probably him. Brad has, for me, so much star potential. And look, it may take some time to really put it all together at the NHL level. But if there's one kid that I really feel like is going to work extremely hard, is going to show up every day, and is going to put in the effort to get there, I feel like it's Lambert. He's got a chip on his shoulder. He plays like it. And I just feel like his future is extremely bright. So very excited about him. Obviously, among our prospects, he is easily near the top of the list. And, should he continue on his development trajectory, he could be one of the best players this team has ever drafted. And he fell to us at 30th overall. Isn't that pretty dang phenomenal? Now, of course, while all of the prospects have basically finished camp now, we're now entering a period of a holding pattern of sorts for the Jets where we're still waiting for maybe another free agent signing, maybe a trade. We're going to talk through some of what we're currently holding out for here in just a little bit as, the Jets are kind of in a weird position, right? It's hard to make a move when you're still waiting for the McGroarty situation to sort of resolve itself. But the Jets do have some stuff in play elsewhere, and we'll focus on that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Obviously, I love sports. It's why I have a podcast. And, I love them enough to where I just hope they would never end. But the NHL season's over. Baseball is still rolling along. But, if you're not somebody who watches it every day, I suppose you probably wouldn't care as much. We're still out of season for the NFL. Hey, the CFL's ongoing. But, for us Blue Bombers fans, maybe not the best time. But it is what it is, right? At least we have the Euros. If you're into footy, that's a pretty fun time. And, at the same time, you know what? You find yourselves still wanting to mess around with some of your favorite sports, right? Maybe you're thinking about the future of the Jets. Maybe you're trying to predict next year's Stanley Cup winner. FanDuel wants to help you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets for any sport you want when you're in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is also hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us again as we're just talking about, the Jets offseason, what's been happening, and obviously with Dev Camp now over, the Jets are kind of entering a bit of a holding pattern, if you will. Winnipeg is looking for some stuff. Obviously, the McGroarty situation continues to hang over their heads. But obviously, the other one that's kind of getting some press is Ehlers. And Ehlers is perhaps one of the more challenging ones because there's a timing question whether it happens, over the summer, maybe towards the trade deadline. When do you get the best bang for your buck? And as you can see from later in the episode, we're going to talk about one particular trade proposal that I would say folks are kind of discussing. It's definitely not the entire package. I would think that there'd probably be some stuff that the Jets might have to consider adding in their case, since Necas is an RFA and Ehlers is a UFA who's 29 and will need a long-term extension for him to really go to Carolina. So a lot of stuff to consider, but obviously we wanted to focus a little bit on sort of where Winnipeg is at. We'll get to that in just a moment, but for those of you who are Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Winnipeg right now is currently waiting on some things. I think that there are some bigger questions for this franchise going forward. Number one, what path do you want to take for this upcoming season? Obviously, the future of this team is fairly planted in moving back towards a draft and develop model, which, every team technically drafts and develops, but how much you really make that the core focus of your roster construction varies. I mean, there are some teams that actually do a lot of trading and free agent signing and build that way. That's not the Jets. They can't really afford to do that. They shouldn't do that, in my opinion. And I think, going through the drafting and developing model and making that your core focus really should be how you build the backbone of your squad. You can do some good free agent and trading acquisitions through some savvy, market and efficiency exploitation, but I wouldn't make it the primary way that you go about this, right? And so for the Jets, this upcoming season is going to be weird, right? They missed out on a number of free agents that I'm pretty sure they were lucky they missed out on, because if they had signed them, I think things would have been not so great for the team long term. But they also do have to reconcile with the fact that the roster depth is going to be a bit of a problem. Obviously, you've got Lambert, Shibakov, and Heinola joining the squad. There's a chance that Salamonson may join the squad at some point this year. Don't know how that's going to shake out. But in the meantime, Winnipeg is going to have to ask a lot of its children to really grow up and become full-time NHLers pretty quickly, which is fine. I think Lambert and Shibakov and Heinola should all be able to handle NHL roles, but I think there's a question of how much you really want to ask of them immediately, right? for all the talent and skill and hard work that they put in, there's just a level of adaptation and comfort that is going to have to require some time at the NHL level before they really start to hit their stride. And so for me, I kind of feel like the Jets need to add a roster player somewhere up front that's of a decent quality and can help insulate some of the youth. I don't think you want to block spots necessarily, and I'm not convinced that adding a big veteran signing is going to be the way to do it. But I keep thinking that like Sprong would be great, right? I've sort of hammered on the Sprong, I guess, campaign for a while now, because I feel like if you're looking for a top six scorer who might be able to slide into a middle six role while still producing pretty effectively, it makes me think that Sprong might be able to help take off some of the goal scoring pressure and offensive creation need from the youth. You're going to get it naturally either way, but I think asking Lambert and Chibrikov and some of the others to immediately step in and replace maybe the likes of Ehlers and guys like that, Monahan, Toffoli, I think that's a lot. I think that's maybe a little bit too much to ask of them as they start off their NHL careers in earnest. Obviously, I don't really have any doubt that they're eventually going to become key contributors, but it's just for this upcoming season, right? If the Jets are still intent on making the playoffs, they kind of need to give themselves some level of insurance. The moment that they have a serious injury, this team starts to go down south really quickly in terms of the roster quality. So, I know last year people will say, well, the team didn't change between, last season and this offseason too much, heading into next year. But if you really think about it, going from a pretty veteran cast that's had a lot of NHL experience, that's comfortable playing up and down the lineup, and that can step up for somebody else who gets injured is kind of radically different than, relying more on the youth. Having, your rookies try to take on these bigger roles, for me is a tougher call. I think it's fine in the long term, and I think it's actually needed, but I also suspect the Jets aren't entirely happy with the roster construction. But I think until the Rutger McGroarty situation really resolves itself, Winnipeg kind of feels a little bit like it's in a stuck place, right? McGroarty could be the piece that gets you a defenseman of sorts. It could also bring you some futures. I don't quite know how this is going to play out because unfortunately, the Jets don't have a ton of leverage, and I don't think that they're going to wait till the trade deadline to make a move. They really can't afford to let this become a situation where Rutgers camp has all the leverage and can just walk into free agency. I don't think you want to do that. I think you want to get this squared away this summer, even if you have to take a bit of a discount, because the likelihood that you're going to get anything good at next year's or at the trade deadline next year is going to be pretty low. Winnipeg sort of needs to sort this out as quickly as possible. And, with Rutgers camp kind of making this as difficult as possible, I just don't know what his value is like. I don't know that you're really going to get a particularly quality roster player out of this. And, if he gets used as part of some Ehlers and swap for like Necas or something, then, the Canes would probably have to add something on their end. So very complicated spot to be in. Winnipeg may try to roll with what it has for the most part, because with all of their free agents by and large going to other teams, I can't imagine that there's many other players they want to sign. Unless I'm missing something, I think for the most part, the Jets have generally solidified their group of veteran players. Now, there are some outside names that I could see them maybe making a play for if they are willing to sort of risk and be a little risky and gamble a bit. But unless they're really intent on bringing in like an Oliver Shillington or something of that nature, which, for Winnipeg's left-sided depth, I don't know that really makes sense. I can't see them doing a lot until the McGroarty situation is resolved. The Ehlers move may come first, and I wouldn't be shocked by that. It would also give them at least some directive as to what they can move Rutger for. But I feel like the Rutger situation really is kind of a huge burden that's hanging over their shoulders, and it's put the season in a bit of a vice grip. I really thought that this was going to get done before the draft hit, but then, all these teams seemingly backed off, and maybe it was because they found out that the Jets just really don't have that much leverage in the situation. Winnipeg is going to have to deal with this sooner than later, but teams might be feeling like they can take a bit of a discount and wait, because if they do, the prices will likely be more favorable. So All that to say, the Rutger situation is really frustrating. It's putting a damper on this offseason and for the progress and moves that the Jets have made. It does feel like this is kind of it's putting a bit of a dour light on the offseason. The Jets did make a couple of other moves recently. They re-signed Logan Stanley and David Gustafson to 2-year deals. The Stanley one, I mean, you know how I feel about Logan. Nice dude, wears his heart on the sleeve. Would not have brought him back for 2 years. He actually got a bit of a raise too for like 40 games of NHL action over the last 2 years. So they keep trying to make him happen and make him work as an NHLer, and I just don't quite see it that way. But I mean, it is what it is, right? He's comfortable. He's familiar with Winnipeg. They seemingly want to keep him around. So, I mean, to some degree, you just have to accept it and move on. But Gus coming back, I mean, is fine. But aside from like these sort of minor fringe moves and stuff, I just don't really think we're going to see a lot else until at least one of these trades comes through. And speaking of trades, right? So Ehlers-for-Necas, I alluded to earlier. That is one that I think is starting to gain some traction as a potential option. We'll talk about what that would entail for the Jets and where Necas actually plays, right? Should it be on the wing? Should it be as a center? We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode, but obviously we're walking through some Jets offseason stuff, and, you know, with Winnipeg kind of in a bit of a holding pattern as they're sort of awaiting at least a trade or two to drop and for them to get some more clarity on their roster situation. One of those trades that they're kind of waiting for is the Ehlers deal, right? He's been aggressively shopped, it sounds like. I think he doesn't have to be traded this summer, but I do suspect the Jets are trying to make that happen a little bit sooner. And it sounds like Carolina is very intent on making something happen. Over the weekend, it was suggested that they are really pushing hard for a deal. At first, we thought maybe the Dylan Coughlin thing was part of it for some reason. Actually turned out to be a nothing burger. Basically, Coughlin was just moved for future considerations rather than the 7th round pick that originally appeared to be a thing. Apparently, it's now just who even cares something in the future down the road. But for the Jets, I suspect that, you know, their concern with the Ehlers is maybe getting a roster player in return. And with the Canes being the one to push, it does make you think that Necas is one of the targets. Marty is a very fun player, and I think he is capable of being a phenomenal finisher. When you look at his highlights, there's a couple of things that stand out. One thing is that he's a very smart positional player. He definitely knows where to be around the goal mouth and around the faceoff circles. He's also a tall, strong skater who's got some really nice stick work and handling, and certainly seems to be capable of carrying the puck himself. Where I tend to have some concern is that Necas is kind of a poacher, right? I think that's a lot of his game. He is very effective down low, but I think a lot of it is because his line mates set him up effectively and give him those chances to really make the most of his release. And it's not like a lot of the goals are from him fooling netminders or anything. A lot of it is actually cashing in on rebounds and stuff. He's got a nose for the net, and I think that's where he's made a lot of his bread and butter. Like I said, he's a strong mobile skater with really good stick handling. So in terms of creating his own space, I think he can do that inside the offensive zone. I don't know if he's quite as strong in transition. Ehlers was the kind of guy who could basically do all of it, you know, transitioning through all 3 zones with possession. I don't think Necas is quite the same player. I think he can do some of it, but again, you know, you look at his actual scoring rates and stuff and how much what he does translates to really meaningful opportunity creation. And it's a little more modest than you'd expect. In fact, his, I think, primary scoring rate was on par with like Zemgus Girgensons, which doesn't seem fantastic. Obviously, you know, you're looking at scoring rates relative to ice time and stuff, and you don't want to read too much into it, but by the same token, it's not painting the best picture. And you'll look at his point scoring last year and think, well, how is that possible? Could be that, you know, a lot of it is coming from power play production, and maybe you're also seeing some impact of him being a figure in plays, but perhaps not being one of the primary creators on these goals. Maybe his teammates are giving him, some secondary scoring points and stuff like that. But I think for me, I like Necas and I think he's a fun player, but the other part of me is kind of a little bit reticent to lock him in, right? His overall production over the past several years has generally been around 40 to 50-ish points. I would say 40 is probably the safe, low end bet. His scoring rates in terms of just raw scoring rates per game, generally, hovering around 0.8 points per game, which is not terrible, pretty decent, in fact. But I don't know, something about his gameplay and the way that he creates offense just makes me wonder what his ceiling is. And he does a lot of it as a winger. He has played center, though, in the past, and with Rod kind of having moved him out, to the wide positions, I sort of wonder if you can even get him back down the middle. For the Jets, obviously, the 2C role is kind of a big gap. As much as I would love to put Brad Lambert there, I think it's asking way too much of him to do that heading into the season. And, one of the big questions is who mans that spot? Is it Cole Perfetti, who's not exactly the fastest, but maybe has the distribution skills and vision to play that role well? Is it Nemesnikov, who did it decently well last season in some minutes alongside Perfetti, and that was workable? Do you try Necas there if he does come to Winnipeg? I don't know. I think asking Lambert immediately to anchor that spot, it's just not a fair ask, and I think it's probably a little bit beyond him right now. I think long-term, yes. I do think that he'll eventually transition to being, maybe Winnipeg's second-line center of the future. But the other thing is his transition numbers have looked very similar to how Ehlers creates space and, does his zone entries. So would you take away from that part of his game if he moves down the middle? I don't know. The wingers are often responsible for a lot of that. And if Brad is more of that kind of player, I actually wonder if that's more where he's suited to. I know that, it's often been said that he's a better center than he is a winger, and that may be true at the lower levels. Don't know how that translates to the NHL level yet. So there's a lot of really big questions going into this preseason and, the run-up of this upcoming year. I feel like we have still not a great sense of how this team is arranged. I've tried to come up with different line combos, and I keep running into some real difficult challenges with how to arrange folks so that you get the best combinations of talent. You try to balance the offense across your top nine, and you give some real insulation for your rookies so that they're not completely isolated and they don't crater in confidence when things go wrong. Brad is one of those players who really thrives off of that confidence, and I suspect he'll be really good next year, but I want to be careful about how much we put on his shoulders and expect from him. I don't think it's going to be a seamless transition. I think the decision-making and timing are going to be a challenge. I think he'll have some moments where he makes a really rough play that maybe he could get away with at the AHL level, and he finds out, NHL, you can't quite do the same thing. Again, like I said, I think he'll adapt relatively quickly, but it might take a half season. So how much you feel comfortable with him trying to man the middle, I think says a lot about what people see in his development cycle. I think he's still a little bit of ways away from being able to do that. It's a lot of responsibility, and I just think he's still a little raw before we get into that sort of territory. He could totally change my perception by preseason, but I think that's likely to be a pretty fair assessment, and I think the coaching staff probably would have some similar expectation. I can't see them starting him at 2C unless they really feel like it's going to be a reasonable enough place to put him, and that they can give him some line mates that can sort of make up for his early rookie deficiencies. So it's a weird balancing act, but assuming Necas comes to Winnipeg as part of some deal, I do think you're going to see a bit of a dip in the transition game, and I don't know how he'll be down the middle because he's not really a defensive center. He's not a strong two-way presence. I would see him as more of a clinical finisher and a poacher around the net, kind of like Vilardi, but Vilardi also offers a lot more threat creation in other ways. I mean, he's kind of in some ways a bit like Tuck. So All this to say that the Jets have a lot of really big questions heading into this offseason. They still have not yet answered a lot of them. I'm curious to know if you think Ehlers-for-Necas makes a lot of sense. Is that the kind of deal you do? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's show, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. As always, have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow, and go Jets go.